man from the Hesperian Church of the Nazarene and his presentation. Simon, merchant of Cyrene, the Friday that changed my life. I carried Jesus' cross.
Thank you for the privilege of coming and sharing with you as a business community. I highly anticipate and appreciate the opportunity to share with fellow business people because that's my line. I work in transporting merchandise from one area to another. In my case, it's dates from Cyrene. Cyrene is on North Africa and it's directly below Athens in Greece. We call it the Great Sea, and so we export up to Athens in Greece. We export over to Egypt. And then when I travel to Jerusalem for Passover each year, they have the finest olive oil in all of our ocean area. And we bring back a great commodity of olive oil and we transport it to Egypt and we send it on up to Athens. And so we market across the ocean. On this occasion, I had just come to Jerusalem for Passover. And as I went out to negotiate in the countryside to acquire my lot of olive oil, I was coming back into the city, and as I approached the city, I noticed a commotion, and I kept walking. This was 30 years ago in my youth. I noticed there were some soldiers. The soldiers had some men between them, and there were crosses. Apparently, they were headed for a crucifixion. The closer I got, the more I saw of these men with the crosses, and one of them would fall under the weight of the cross. The Romans had the cruelest form of torture for those who they considered to have violated their laws. And they would tie them to a stake. They would beat them with a cat of nine tails. And each part of those nine tails was embedded with a piece of metal, bone, glass, or stone. So that as you received the 40 lashes, you actually received 360. It would render the back of the person into ribbons of flesh, bleeding, broken, and there were those who died under the scourging. This man was physically exhausted. As I approached and attempted to pass them and go into the city for my Passover observations, the soldier reached out and grabbed me. He was a Roman soldier, and you don't take issue with the Roman soldier when you have been conscripted, and he said, carry the cross. I reached down to take hold of the cross. And as I reached down, I looked into the eyes of this man that I knew not, and I saw the kindest eyes I've ever seen. They were gentle. They were loving. They were caring. And it was like I had seen the purest face that I have ever known. It was swollen. I later discovered they had beat him with all of the soldiers taking a part and making sport of him. I picked up the cross. In that look, it was as though he had looked into me. And he had seen me and he accepted me. He loved me. He cared for me. It all was just in a moment of a look. I carried the cross and we went out the city and to Golgotha, or the hill that is called the skull, and that was where they would crucify their victims, and they proceeded to lay them out on the cross beam and the cross. And they pounded the nails, the spikes into their flesh, and the cries of agony rang out. And then they lifted the cross and they had holes. And the pole of the cross went down in the hole with a thud and jarred their flesh. And they cried out, and the criminals that were nailed on the side began to cuss and to swear and in violence of all kinds of verbal expressions. By this time I had learned that the man whose cross I was carrying was none other than Jesus, the prophet, the one who had made blind eyes to see, ears to hear, lame limbs to walk, the one who, I heard, had raised Lazarus from the dead. And here he was hanging on the cross. There was a crown of thorns on his head and an inscription above that read, "The King of the Jews," in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. I discovered that the religious leaders didn't appreciate that and asked Pilate to change it and say, he said he was the king of the Jews. And Pilate said, what I've written, I've written. He wasn't happy about what they made him do. As they hung there on the cross, it was now 9 o'clock in the morning. And the time went by slowly. They had wine vinegar for them to drink because the Romans wanted to sustain their victims for as long as they could so that they would hang on the cross sometimes as long as 2 days. And everybody who would see them would know that Rome didn't tolerate any kind of insurrection or any kind of disobedience. As the two nailed on the crosses next to him raged in fury at the pain and the agony, I was amazed. It was as though Jesus was in charge. In fact, he said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. I was taken aback that that was his response. The criminals continued to heap abuse, and now it was 12 o'clock. They'd been on the cross for 3 hours, and their darkness set in. It was as though a cloud bank had come. There was no rain. It was as though it was almost night. You could still see, and I could see those that had gathered around the cross. There were some women there and some men. It was now about 2 o'clock, and I heard one of the criminals rebuke his friend because his friend was now maligning Jesus and saying, if you're the Son of God, get yourself down and take us down too, and let's get out of here. And the other one said, don't you have any shame? Don't you realize we deserve the punishment that we are receiving? This is a just man. And he looked at Jesus and he said, Lord, would you remember me when you come into your kingdom? And Jesus responded, this day you'll be with me in paradise. Standing there below the cross were these women and some men, and I later learned that it was his mother. And he looked at her and he said, woman, behold your son. And to John the disciple he said, behold your mother. I can't even begin to understand the anguish that went through that poor woman's heart to see her son so abused, so tortured, so torn. The son she loved and nurtured that she knew would be a special man of God, and this was not the end that she had envisioned it would be, but it was the end that there was that she saw. And John took her in to his home and took care of her as his own mother. It was now approaching 3 o'clock. The darkness was there. It was eerie. Everyone said they didn't quite understand what was happening. It wasn't normal. And Jesus cried out in a loud voice and said, I'm thirst. And they took a sponge and put it in the wine vinegar and put it on a long reed and held it up to his mouth, and he sucked from the straw. And then he said, it is finished. And right after that he said, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. There was an earthquake, a violent earthquake that shook everything. The soldiers were all shook up, and they looked, and here he was, his head was down, he was quit breathing, he was dead. And they said, surely this must have been a righteous man. And one of the soldiers I later discovered was a centurion. He said, this must have been the Son of God. I didn't know it at the time, but the veil of the temple was torn in two from the top to the bottom, a great, big, heavy, thick curtain. And it was as though God said, I'm going to open up the Holy of Holies, and so that all can come to the holiness of God. There is no separation. I didn't understand all of that there at that time, but later, as I read from the author of Hebrews, I discovered that he said it was as though Jesus' body was ripped in two so that we could see the heart of God. I don't know if you've ever had a child or a loved one who has been so errant and so wild that you would have given your life if that would have caused them to have life and to turn from their addictions and waywardness. We can't do that. But God was able to do that by giving his Son, who is life and cannot be held by death, because when we went home on the Sabbath and then came up on Sunday, the word spread that the tomb was empty, the stone was rolled away. And then on Monday and Tuesday we had word that the disciples had seen him, that he was in the flesh and he was alive, and that life could not be extinguished. I can't quite comprehend all that happened, but it was my privilege to carry Jesus' cross and find life from him who was crucified. He's alive.